Okay. Please forgive the primitive nature of my presentation technology. This is poor person's PowerPoint, otherwise known as Word. And you see my affiliation and the title of my talk, Philosophical Substance Abuse, Distorting Descartes and Dismissing Dualism. I'm going to try to come to the defense of Rene Descartes, and we learned recently that I may be able to make him feel better in his time by going backwards myself. So, consciousness, what is it? We don't really know, and yet we all have it. The mind-body problem, what is that? Well, that's deeply related to the question of what is consciousness and where does consciousness originate. The mind-body problem is the question of what is the relationship between mind and body? Does body create mind, or is there something else going on? And two of the major historical points of view are, first, dualism, the idea that mind is primary, independent, not physical, and does not die with the body and does not depend on the body for its existence. This was the predominant view of philosophers and everybody on the planet for a very long time, according to Popper and Eccles. But as scientists began to construct the scientific method and science advanced over time, dualism started to lose its respect. And in fact, ironically, it was Rene Descartes that helped lead to the demise of dualism, even though he was one of its primary proponents. The idea that arose instead of dualism was materialism, which an earlier speaker called physicalism, and that's really essentially the same thing. The idea that the mind is a product of the living brain and ceases to exist when the brain meets its death. Dualism in philosophical and psychological circles has been beaten to death and buried. It no longer is viable. It is over. Anyone who believes in dualism, at best, is deluded. And so that's me. Descartes' view of substance from his Meditations on First Philosophy. This is something that I think the physicalists should read so that they know what it is they're denying and denouncing before they do it. Rene Descartes had several ideas in his mind trying to distinguish between mind and body. He said that both mind and body are substances. What is a substance? It's a thing that's capable of existing independently. I found that a rather oblique definition when I first started studying this, but lately I started to understand when I heard some ideas from Aristotle, an example of a non-substance would be a shadow. A shadow requires a source of light and an object. It does not exist independently. It cannot exist without those things. But the source of light and the object can exist without the shadow and can exist independently. So they would be made of a substance. Third, Descartes said that the mind is a thinking and non-extended substance. And here's where he started to get into trouble with his third sentence. Whereas the body is non-thinking and extended. What did he mean by extension? Well, it's rather complicated. I don't have the time to stand here and read all the quotes that I provide. I'm hoping that you're scanning those as I talk. But his idea of extension included the idea that two things with extension cannot occupy the same physical space. That is, the exclusionary occupation of space by matter, which is a well-known principle in physics. And accordingly, he said, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. And that's a point-blank statement of dualism. Fifth, he defined an extended substance as having three dimensions with shape and motion. The body, as an extended substance, also has the property of exclusionary occupation of space, as I was just saying. Seventh, mind and body differ further in that body is divisible physically. It can be cut apart. Whereas mind, he says, is utterly indivisible. And by that he means with physical means, like knives or whatever. And then lastly, the human body is an interactive union of mind and body. And here's another place he got himself in trouble, because he could not explain how the interaction occurs. And this, above all else, has been cited as a reason why it's obvious that dualism is false. So, objections, there are many. I just picked one because it's the usual objection, and it's what I just stated. If the brain is physical and the mind is non-physical, then how can the brain and the mind interact? This is posed as a rhetorical question, a question with the answer already incorporated into it. By using the term non-physical this way, the person asking such a question is implicitly defining a non-physical entity as not able to interact with a physical entity. That's what makes it non-physical. And so the question contains the answer, and we're supposed to say, oh, you're right, it's over, there is no interactionism, there is no duality, there is no dualism. Well, that's a bit of taking Descartes too far, in my opinion. And materialists have been at this for centuries, picking on poor Rene Descartes. And they have exaggerated and sharpened the other distinctions that he made into a description of the non-physical substance as something that's really untenable. The non-physical mind has neither mass nor energy, is not localizable in any way in space, is not extended in space, does not exist in space, has no physical properties whatsoever, has nothing in common with physical things, and is completely independent of anything material and works independently of the brain. Okay, that's too much. They've gone over the ledge here, and to tell an interactionist that his point of view is that the mind works independently of the brain is to not listen when the guy says, I'm an interactionist. So, no, this is not what Descartes thought. However, it's become the way he's described. My objection, if the body and the mind both fit the definition of substance, according to Descartes, who coined the term to describe things that are substantial, then these two examples of substances must share some common properties. That is the definition of substance. They both have to meet that definition. And this point seems to have escaped the physicalist, materialist thinkers. So how do we gain traction on such a slippery problem? How do we approach the idea and generate some ideas about what exactly could another substance besides matter be and mean? So we need some empirical data. And we also need some theoretical help. And I'm going to ask Albert Einstein for help today. And I'm going to, with apologies, ask Brian Greene for some help. He was here last weekend for the ICEAM conference, and he was, shall we say, not exactly intrigued by my ideas. And so I apologize to him here. My invoking him in this talk, if he were here, he would be outraged. And I'm sorry he's not here. What do I call empirical data? Here's where I get myself in even more trouble. The near-death experience. Most of you have probably heard of this. This occurs usually when a person comes close to physical death or actually physically dies and is resuscitated. There are many, many thousands bordering, well, there are millions of people who have claimed to have the experience and many thousands of published reports. And I could talk to you for 7 or 8 hours on the phenomenon alone. But I've picked 2 reports that illustrate one principle that's really critical to what I have to tell you at the end of the talk. These are reports in the operating room of people who died on the table and were resuscitated and then told their stories later on. And the first person says, as they, that is the doctors and nurses, came by, they wouldn't seem to notice me. They would just keep walking with their eyes straight ahead. And this is the person who's dissociated from his or her body and observing what's going on in the operating room. As they came real close, I would try to turn around to get out of their way, but they would just walk through me. Okay, you're entitled to say, okay, these people are psychotic. However, I spent my entire master's thesis showing that they weren't. So I'll mail it to you if you need to read it. The second account. I'm trying to stop them, the doctors. I really did try to grab a hold of them and stop them because I really felt happy where I was, which is dead. I actually remember grabbing the doctor. The interviewer asked, what happened? The experiencer says, nothing, absolutely nothing. It was almost like he wasn't there. Well, he was there, and so was the experiencer, but they were different somehow, weren't they? And in fact, there's a superposition of the experiencer over physical bodies with no interaction. So I am going to have to accelerate myself way beyond my normal range. Consider Einstein's famous equation with a whole bunch of changes. E equals S sub I, C to the I, where I is an integer, 0 to whatever. S0 would be energy itself, since C to the 0 is 1. S1 would be what I'm calling essence, the non-material thinking substance. S2 would be matter. This is just for illustration purposes. You can think of a way to construct a substance from energy that is not matter, simply by considering such a simple relationship. So the essence that I call the non-material substance would be constructed completely differently from energy. It would still be constructed from energy, but differently, so differently that it could overlap with matter and not even interact with it except under certain circumstances. Einstein has helped us understand with his E equals mc squared equation that there could be other forms of substance, but he hasn't given us any kind of structural advice. So let's turn to Brian Greene. And as you see here, string theory comes directly from Newtonian mechanics, because in the upper left-hand corner we have Newton's apple. And Newton didn't know it at the time, but his apple was composed of many apple atoms. And each apple atom has what were once called elementary particles, electrons, protons, neutrons. Those have been shown to consist of quarks. String theory has told us that the quarks themselves are composed of strings. Strings are supposed to be the fundamental unit of everything. And so string theory is a grand unification theory in the sense that Einstein wanted. However, this is an artist's misconception, because material particles are open-ended strings, and what he's shown here is a closed-ended string. So this is not drawn quite right. However, we're going to go ahead. What are things in terms of strings? Closed-loop strings are one type. These are free-floating, tiny vibrating circular strands of energy. The open-ended strings are the other type. These are bound to our four-dimensional space-time, 3 physical spatial dimensions, 1 time dimension at each end. So the open-ended strings are actually part of our universe. What string theory claims is that different amounts of energy are represented by different vibrational modes of the strings, translating to different masses of particles. Gravitons, predicted by relativity, are, in string theory, closed-loop strings that only temporarily stay in this universe and then leave it. So string theory is meant to account for the weakness of gravity by saying that most gravitons never exert any force on a physical object. They leave the universe first. And that's one of the strengths of string theory. But how do we test it? No one's been able to test it. I suggest to you that the near-death experience represents a test of this theory, that what I call the essence, the dissociated non-material mind, is in fact a closed-loop string, or maybe more than one closed-loop string, that allows it to overlap with matter because the closed-loop string is not attached to space-time. And secondly, to be even more outrageous, consciousness is in the closed-loop string, although not necessarily originating from it. It may be vice versa, I suspect. And the closed-loop string, that is the essence, as I call it, the human mind, is capable of leaving the universe. And if that's not renegade enough for you, my apologies. Therefore, I believe that the old ideas of Rene Descartes about substance have been given a new life, a new way of thinking about them at the very least, and a new way of gathering information by using human experience, subjective experience, as scientific data in the area of consciousness. I really don't see how we can divorce first-person experience from consciousness and study consciousness from solely a third-person account. So I believe that we have evidence to think that way. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions and comments, and I will exert chair's privilege just to comment that relying on string theory to give us an idea of the true nature of physics seems to be getting increasingly dodgy these days, despite the best propaganda efforts of folks like Brian Greene.
Let me add one idea to that. Brian Greene taught me indirectly through television that M theory summarizes the 5 subservient variants of string theory, unifies them, and predicts a 4th spatial dimension. So I believe that my ideas are evidence of his theory, but he was not interested in that kind of evidence.
I see a question.
Hi, Bernie.
Bernie Williams. First, I want to agree with York, and then I want to agree with you, and then I want to note that a lot of the intersubjective turn that we're taking has to do with reviving ancient traditions like Maria does, and to note that I don't think it's ironic that we have one and only one remaining fragment from Leucippus. Now, for those of you who aren't antique Greeks, Leucippus was Democritus's teacher, the proposer of atoms, right? What is the one remaining fragment? A description of particles of nous, particles of mind.
I am assuming I don't have to answer that.
Comments would be welcome, however.
I'm not sure I know how to comment on that.
Juan Acosta, I'm a neurophysiologist that does consciousness studies now, and I like exploring altered states and recording them on the EEG. So try this one on. The brain is a quantum mechanical electrochemical meat machine that collapses the wave function. And then if you want to get even more confused, what we're all doing here is our brains are studying our brains, and our brains are studying our consciousness. So you can never get out of the problem of the brain is part of the mix. I started going to the Science of Consciousness conferences years ago, and all these debates happened every day, and then different camps were formed. The neurophenomenologists, the nerve net people, the modelers, the subjective experience people. You have to look at the whole gamut. So I encourage people to explore altered states of consciousness where you can have these experiences of out of body, you can have these experiences of your consciousness moves to different locations, you can have telepathic, we all know some of this. Thank you for a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yuri Kron. I wonder if you know that in Kabbalistic science there was already superstring theory.
In which science?
Kabbalistic science. No, you can read it in the book of Dr. Paul and Bury, published in 1925. It says that all universe, including physical substance, is created from primal vibrations of two types. One is like a snake swallowing its own tail, which is closed loop string, right? And another corkscrew principle, which is unrestricted. And vibrations of these two types of strings make the whole world. So this is pretty interesting that they knew about it.
Very interesting. Thank you.
And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions.